Well, good morning and welcome back to Musings of a Texas Preacher Man. I'm Scott Fisher and I'm glad you've chosen to study with me this morning. In a previous episode, I briefly mentioned the blood of Abel and its significance to the Messianic kingdom. His blood is mentioned 3 times in the New Testament, and one of those times is by Jesus. Now, I was puzzled for years regarding the significance of the blood of Abel and why it is so significantly mentioned in the New Testament. In our study this week, we're going to begin to look at the role of Abel's shed blood and how it ties in directly to eschatology. Let's start by looking at the story of Cain killing Abel in Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 4, beginning at verse 1. Now the man had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain, and she said, I have gotten a man-child with the help of the Lord. Again she gave birth to his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of flocks, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. Now let me just stop right here. First of all, again, this is Cain is the older brother, Abel is the younger brother. Now this concept of the older brother persecuting the younger brother continues all the way through the Old Testament and up into the New Testament. We have Cain who kills Abel. We have Ishmael who persecutes Isaac, again the older brother and the younger brother. We have the sons of Jacob, the 12 sons who persecute Joseph, the older brothers persecuting the younger brother. We get up into the New Testament, and all of that is a picture of the older brother, first century Judaism, persecuting the younger brother, the followers of Jesus. All right, now that just gives you a little bit of background. All right, let's get back to verse 3. So it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. Abel, on his part also, brought of the firstlings of his flock and their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and for his offering. But for Cain and for his offering, he had no regard. So Cain became very angry, and his countenance fell. Now, let me take a moment to discuss the significance of what's been said so far. First of all, we're told that Abel was a keeper of flocks and Cain was a tiller of the ground. Now let's establish that there's nothing more righteous about Abel's occupation than Cain's occupation. One raised animals, one was a farmer and raised crops. Now some then want to distinguish between their offerings, that somehow Abel's offering was more righteous than Cain's offering. And the answer is no. The issue was not the offering. The issue was the condition of their heart before God. Notice what the text actually says. The Lord had regard for Abel and for his offering. But for Cain and for his offering, he had no regard. Now, this ties directly into Jesus' teaching regarding the bringing of an offering to God while one remembers that your brother has something against you. Matthew chapter 5, beginning at verse 23. Therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. Notice that the condition of the heart affects the acceptance of the offering. Make things right with your brother, and then come and present your offering. The problem with Cain was Cain's heart, not his offering. As for Cain and for his offering, the Lord had no regard. Now we continue in verse 6. Then the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. Now, Jesus began his discussion of presenting an offering with the statement in Matthew chapter 5, verse 21. You have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. Verse 22, but I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. Now back in Genesis chapter 4, the Lord asked Cain, why are you angry? Cain's heart was darkened by anger and resentment toward his brother. And God appeals to Cain, wrestle with and overcome the sin that's crouching at the door of your heart. Notice what he said to him. If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door and its desire is for you, but you must master it. Now, I believe that same instruction applies to you and I today. Here, instead of dealing with the sin, Cain gives in to it and he kills his brother. Verse 8 of Genesis 4, Cain told Abel his brother, and it came about when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. And the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? And he said, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said to him, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Now, this is the first act of murder, the first act of violence recorded in the scripture. And the voice of Abel's blood was crying out to God from the ground. What was the blood of Abel crying out for? His blood was crying out for God's righteous vengeance, for justice. Now, this is a subject that makes many modern day Christians very uncomfortable. There's a popular view of God today that sugarcoats his nature and character. It focuses only on one aspect of God. He is a God of love. He is the very essence of love. Now, this syrupy view of God ignores and repudiates any teaching that varies from this. Let me say very clearly, first up, I believe God is love. I believe God loved the world so much that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him would not perish but have everlasting life. That is the heart of the gospel. But Jesus had much to say about judgment and vengeance and even wrath. And the preachers of a syrupy, sweet Jesus tend to dismiss, ignore, and repudiate this equally significant attribute of God. Now, the popular message of today is no judgment, no wrath, no consequence. Now, I want you to see, Jesus responds to a statement from one of his disciples, Philip. Lord, show us the Father, Philip said. And Jesus responds to Philip, he who has seen me has seen the Father. Now this is important. Jesus is the full revelation of who God is. Jesus and the Father are one. The writer of Hebrews tells us that Jesus is the radiance of his glory and the exact representation of his nature, and he upholds all things by the word of his power. That's Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3. Listen, you want to know what God is like? You look at Jesus. You look at what he said, and you look at what he did. And that is the revelation of the Father. In Colossians, Paul wrote about Jesus saying in verse 15, Colossians 1 verse 15, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is also the head of the body, the church, and he's the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he himself will come to have first place in everything. Everything is building toward that. For it was the Father's good pleasure for all the fullness to dwell in him, and through him to reconcile all things to himself, having made peace through the blood of his cross. Through him, I say, whether things on earth or things in heaven. Now, Jesus is the full, undiluted manifestation, representation of the Father. Matthew chapter 23 stands in stark contrast to the syrupy sweet Jesus of modern day evangelicalism. I challenge you to study it carefully. Now this morning we're going to pick up on Jesus' reference to the blood of Abel. It just happens to be in Matthew chapter 23. Matthew chapter 23, beginning at verse 29. Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. They're sweet and syrupy for you. For you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we'd been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So I want you to notice the context of what he's talking about now is the shedding of the blood of the prophets who came to Israel throughout the scriptures, and over and over and over again, the fathers of Israel murdered the prophets. Now, verse 31. So you testify against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers. What's he saying? Listen, they are going to kill him. And the filling up of the measure of the guilt of their fathers was going to be the murder of Jesus and the murder of his apostles that would come to them afterwards. Now look what Jesus says, verse 33. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? Therefore, behold, Now notice, I'm sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify. And some of them you will scourge where? In your synagogues. And you will persecute them from city to city. So that, now look at this, verse 35, so that upon you, these first century apostate Jews who were going to crucify Jesus and kill his apostles, he says, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. Now, in this passage, Jesus prophesies of the coming destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of their temple. Behold, your house, your temple, is being left to you desolate. That first century generation of apostate Jews, led by the scribes and Pharisees, was going to be held accountable for all of the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, from A to Z, literally, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Now notice, Jesus is warning them of what is going to come. They were going to have more prophets and wise men sent to them, and they were going to persecute them. They were going to scourge them in their synagogues, and they were going to kill and crucify some of them. All of the righteous blood, from the time of Abel to the crucifixion of Jesus and the killing of the apostles, all of it was going to be held against that generation. The blood of Abel and the blood of all the righteous was crying out from the ground. Crying out for what? Crying out for vengeance. And folks, that vengeance came in 70 AD when Jerusalem and the temple was destroyed, just as Jesus told them was going to happen. Well, I want to thank you for studying with me this morning. If what I'm sharing with you goes against what you've always believed, don't be afraid or intimidated. Let the scriptures be your source. And we're going to pick up right here again tomorrow morning as we continue to study the truth of the Messianic kingdom. And we're going to continue to look at the vengeance poured out on Jerusalem for the blood of the righteous. I want to thank you for joining me for Musings of a Texas Preacher Man. And I hope you'll continue to join me Tuesday mornings through Friday mornings each week right here. And why not click on the subscribe button on the lower right corner of your screen, and you'll be notified in YouTube whenever a new video gets posted. And if you're watching on Facebook, consider sharing this on your wall and invite your friends to watch it. If you saw it on Twitter, retweet it and encourage your friends to watch. And if you live in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, why not join me on Tuesday nights at 7 p.m. for Tuesday Nights in the Word. We'll be here tonight. Come out and join us. I hope you'll go out and make today a great day.